Friday, and that means it's Science Friday around here, which I really should have like some sound effects. There we go. A little applause for Science Friday around here. Some people I know listen to. I can't get the applauding to stop. Please, applauders, just stop applauding. But it is a day when we bring on a special co-host, a special partner in all of this. Many of these Fridays, you're going to be with astrophysicist Paul Wallace, a real-life astrophysicist, and he doesn't think I should, make fun of that every time. But I'm not making fun of it. I think it's fantastic. I know, you now know, an astrophysicist. And we're going to talk a little bit about science. So it's really good to see you. And as we like to joke around here, good to be seen by you and also good to be heard by you. So if you're a regular podcast listener, you can pick up all the details of this and watch it at the end. I'll tell you at the end where you can watch this online. And if you're online, stick around. We'll tell you the other places where you can share this as well. So, Paul, it's Astrophysicist Day or Science Day with an astrophysicist. And I'm standing in the Vote Common Good studios here in Minneapolis, where it is like 0 degrees outside right now. And it's going to just get colder over the next week. And that's what I'm doing. That's where I am. If you're watching this on the live streams, tell us where you are. Tell us what you're up to, including you, Paul. Where are you and what are you up to?
I am coming to you from Decatur, Georgia, which is you might have heard of it. Atlanta is a suburb of Decatur. It's true, actually. Historically, it's true. Decatur was here first. So? Yeah, and it's right up against the city of Atlanta. So basically, it's for most people who are not from around here, it's Atlanta, and it is. I was just checking; it is 8 degrees outside here.
What? Say that number again. You kind of broke up. It's how warm?
48. 48. Yeah, 48 degrees out there.
Paul, we're going to be talking on many of these Fridays here about science and how we should think about science. Why do so many people find it difficult to trust science? What can we do about it? And, the weather is like this most frequently experienced science moment for people, right? Some meteorologist or some group of meteorologists at a weather app, they get together and they take all their scientific data and they predict the future. And I have long wondered, and when we used to talk about this on the radio show that we were on together, I've wondered if the weather predictions is one of these things that just keeps people saying things like, well, science, what do they know about things? It can't even predict the weather, And I would imagine we should have a meteorologist on in our conversation one of these coming weeks. I bet that's really, really hard. That's really, really hard science to accomplish.
It's probably a mess, but basically, I don't trust it outside of 4 to 5 days in the future.
Right.
As a physicist, I kind of doubt. I doubt it. And I've got this. You go to weather.com and it gives you a 15-day forecast.
Yeah. Well, I want to believe that's true about myself. I say things like, "Oh, I'm sure it's not that way." But if it looks like great weather for the next 14 days. I take that as a promise from God. And if it doesn't come true, I am just, I feel like somehow I was cheated by that.
Maybe that's the reason why science is getting a bad name, because of all those meteorologists making 15-day forecasts.
Maybe they should stay in their lane, right? How about tomorrow?
Stay in their lane, yeah.
Or today. And we won't pick on weather all the time. But I've literally, when we were on the Vote Common Good tour, we traveled all over the country. We were and doing outdoor events. We would worry about the weather every day. And there's just some people in their lives, in their work, and whatever they do, that outdoor weather is a thing that you actually think about. And there were times where I'm telling you, I'd have a weather app in my hand and it would say 0% chance of rain while it was raining on us. Right. So we can get into wet weather predictions later and descriptions. But that's one of the places we talk about science, obviously, is the meteorological science side. Mm-hmm. You mention yourself as a physicist, and you really are a true-blown astrophysicist.
As true.
As the co-host, here for Fridays, so let people know, what is an astrophysicist? What do you do? Now, you're a professor, so you teach at a college and all.
Yeah.
But what is an astrophysicist? And as we think about science, what do you know and experience and do as a scientist that makes the special contribution as a physicist and specifically as an astrophysicist?
Well, what astrophysicists do is it's kind of what you would call pure science as opposed to applied science. Lots of scientific work is done in the name of building the next great can opener, or growing taller basketball players or whatever. But the science that I do is of a purely exploratory kind. It's essentially looking up at the sky and asking ourselves, what's the universe like? Where do we come from, from a physical point of view? What's the cosmos like? And it's a matter of looking and looking and looking and observing and making conclusions and testing them over and over again. And if you've ever watched a show like Cosmos, with Neil deGrasse Tyson, came out a few years ago, what you see in those kind of presentations is sort of the product, if you will, of all of this work. I'm just one of many who explores the cosmos, telescopes and so forth.
So I don't know a whole lot about science, about physics like you do, but one of the things that I've learned in the physics conversation is there's a difference between the super teeny, like people that do physics and break an atom apart to figure out what's going on, and the things that happen on the macro scale or the big stuff. At least I think that's true. Is that actually true? And what does that tell us about science? Like, as people pursue their, I want to be a person who trusts science, this big thing in our society right now, right? Like, trust the scientists. That's it's a great phrase, but it's a little complicated because how do you trust something you don't really understand? And science is complicated. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, well, on your first question, there are scientists who study things that are super teeny tiny, and then there's scientists like me who tend to study things that are super big. But over the last 20 years or so, there have been sort of points of great connection between those two fields. They're not really separate anymore.
So someone like me carries.
I can go into that deeper if you want to, but basically you can think of some events in space, some events out there, some objects out there give insight into the tiniest, neutrons and so forth, tiniest particles. So they're not really separate anymore.
Well, see, and this is what I find interesting about the science conversation is that we're all trying to keep up, right? Which is kind of the point of science. Yeah. It seems to me like when you do an intro to science course at the college that you teach at, I'm sure you're having to help college students, and oftentimes the old joke, it proves true that education is wasted on us when we're young.
Yeah,
a lot of us would like to learn this stuff when we're an adult. When you just say here's what science is, how do you talk about the, I don't know if you call it the discipline of science or the arena of science or the approach of science? Because science isn't some separate thing in our lives. It's a way of viewing the world. Is that an accurate way?
Yeah. I tell them I'm a bird watcher. I'm a bird guy. I'm a birder. Okay. Not a bird watcher is not the right term, actually. And I tell them, if you go out into the woods and you start looking at birds and you start noticing this one's slightly different from that one, and you start looking at details and make observations, that is a purely scientific activity. I mean, it's not like we're talking about deep mysteries here. It's simply looking and observing and drawing conclusions. And, that is a fully scientific activity, birding. It's something that anybody can do. So it's not really mysterious, but it gets mysterious because once you're at it for a while, you develop a language around it. And it seems remote and mysterious, especially when you talk about things like quasars or positrons, and it becomes sort of mysterious that way. What you said earlier was interesting, that how can we believe scientists if we don't understand them? Mm-hmm. And that is really, really key. And I think that people, popular science educators have an enormously important role in helping people know what science is and how it operates.
because we do it, right? I mean, to your point about like what science is, the operating theme of this daily podcast for all the topics that we talk about, whether it's issues or politics or faith or the news or on science on Fridays, is what's going on in the world. It's one of our big questions, and what can we do in light of it, right? These are the human questions. Yeah. And that sounds to me like what you're saying science really is, the question of observing and detailing and understanding what's happening. Mm-hmm. And then that gives us responses, or we get to make suggestions about what could be or what is or how we understand. So, but it's that pursuit of like knowledge or understanding what's happening. Yeah. Is that fair? Is that a fair way to?
It's fair. It's totally fair. And it can change your entire view of who we are.
And so when people say, as they do, I don't always trust science, right? It's a big deal. It shows up in our civic life. Obviously, it's a big thing in the coronavirus right now. It's a big thing with these vaccines. It's a big thing when someone goes to a doctor. Like, rarely do people say that about like their cell phone and how that operates, right? Like the microchip technology, people are pretty much like, I get that it works and I want it to work a little better and I don't want them tracking me, but I kind of believe the science that makes my phone work. Like, I know it's not magic. I'm sure someone's just figured out like how these things go and they've made it work. But when people say, and we'll look at some graphs on the question that Pew researchers asked the American population over the last 4 years what they think of science. When they say, I don't trust science or I don't believe science, what do you think they're saying? And how does that strike you as a person who's in the sciences?
Well, in one way, I really understand it because there is sort of a sense of mystery around it a lot of times because of the fact that it's a language and it's kind of a big club, and it is sort of a people don't really normally see science happening. You know, it's just sort of this big black box. You know, right. But if they don't trust it, I would ask them to investigate that and ask. I would ask them, why don't you trust it? What grounds do you have for not trusting it? And investigate, like a real scientist, investigate what it is you're thinking, and see if what you're thinking is really true or not. That's asking a lot, maybe, but that's all scientists do, is they ask questions and question their assumptions. It's a big part of science is questioning assumptions.
Yeah. I want to get back to that in a minute because I think as we, this being our first Friday of talking about, common good science, that how we're going to think about science is helpful and interesting. And so, while many of these Fridays we will interview other scientists, we'll talk with people that are making discoveries, we'll like get into the specifics. This sort of basic way to think about science, I really like. I think it's really helpful. And for me, actually, it has to serve as a reminder because there are times where, I forget that what science wants to do in the human project is to suggest how things are and then to double check, triple check, and make sure that those previous assumptions and conclusions are indeed continuing to prove out to be true. So there's this strange thing in science, right? That it's like trust scientists, but also recognize that sometimes new understanding comes in that corrects old wrong assumptions.
Absolutely.
And that is what I think is confusing to people, frankly. Like
people really have a hard time holding those two things at the same time. The contingency of knowledge, it's like, I saw this funny thing that says like, you get a bachelor's degree and you think you know something, you get a master's degree and you start to wonder, you get a PhD and you can't believe on what a thin basis all of human knowledge rests. It's just, everything is, and so there's this point at which, knowledge is contingent, but you also have to trust it because it's the best we have. Yeah. It's a tension, but it's a creative tension. It's a good tension.
All right. So before we jump into these charts, you and I both personally adhere to a Christian spirituality to help us live in the world and to drive it. And a lot of people will say, well, that's why that notion of contingent knowledge, and that it's going to always be held up to scrutiny, and that our human capacity to understand something is limited by us as much as it is the knowable nature of the knowledge and all this.
Yeah.
That's the thing that causes people to say, well, then if I have to contrast or compare two truth claims in the world, why not just go with the one that comes from a religious tradition as opposed to ones that come from science, if science is, sort of arguing with itself all the time? There's something really appealing to people to believe that, when it comes to your faith, that's a little more, that might not answer all the science questions, but it's a little more trustworthy.
Well, if people think that religious people are not arguing amongst themselves as well, then I think they're being disingenuous on some level. Mm-hmm. There's, if you're looking for certainty, you're not going to find it anywhere.
There it is.
And additionally, there's no reason on the outset to set science and religion against one another.
Yeah.
Unless you are going to insist on particular, for example, readings of the Bible, literal sort of a very physical, very concrete, literal understanding, say, of Genesis, then you're going to have problems. But if you can let that go for a moment, you might see there's deeper things happening, even in, Genesis itself, other than what's on the surface.
And I'm sure this will come up in our coming weeks, that there certainly are religious people who push against science and will say, like, don't believe them, don't trust them, right? Or don't believe these scientists, believe these other ones. And science is not as trustworthy as you want. They start sounding like our former president of the United States, right? Like, science, who knows? Right. I mean, nobody can really understand all this stuff.
And there's also people on the extreme far left who reject science. It tends to happen on both. I think it's more obvious on the right. I think everything seems more. I think the extreme hard right is an obvious cultural thing right now. But I have found science skeptics on the far left as well.
Oh, really?
Yeah, anti-vaxxers, people, environmentalists, whoever. Not all environmentalists, don't get me wrong, but sort of an extreme version. I'm talking about extreme.
Yeah, that's.
But it's not as pronounced. It's not as pronounced.
And probably not as publicly well supported. That's a really good reminder to all of us.
Or religiously supported. They're not
religiously supported.
Yeah.
It's a good reminder to us that many of our areas of human engagement have extremists. And extremists tend to act the same. They tend to use this. There's an extremist action that goes on regardless of what the topic is.
Yeah.
Pardon my coughing.
And I won't say there's very fine people. I won't say there's very fine people on both sides. I'm not trying to make it. Well played. I'm not trying to equivocate here, but I am that there are, in fact, they do in fact show up on both ends of the spectrum.
Right. It's interesting. And there are people in science that don't trust religious people, right?
Oh God, that's true.
Yeah. Do you experience any of that in your?
Virtually never have I experienced outward hostility of any kind, but it comes across more as I'm just more of a curiosity, than I am like people don't come at me. But a lot of scientists, religious claims, religious sort of religion just doesn't compute. It's just like off the map, It's not that they're hostile. It's just like, why would you even do that?
Right.
Why would you even spend your time thinking about religious questions? It doesn't compute.
It's interesting you say that, because as a longtime working pastor, that's also a very common question among working pastors about religion. What are we doing? What are we doing? Why are we thinking about it this way?
I do find myself. I'm a pastor as well, part time, and I do find myself when I'm like giving communion or something. I'm like, what is this?
What exactly are we doing here?
What a strange job I have.
Yeah, and boy, I just feel like so I don't want to do the whole history of science, but there was a point at which religious communities dominated whole parts of Western civilization, and so the science project was part and parcel with the religious communities, because things in sort of thinking in the mid-centuries of Western development, religion, Christian religion especially, the scientists were embedded in that system, and then a schism happened. And I feel like maybe there's sort of a coming back together, or I hope there is. But can we take a look at the results from this Pew studies? So Pew, big researching group, did some surveying, which when you say politics, they call it polling. And polling science is its own little thing, right? Like every time I notice some scientific endeavor that people don't respect, I get nervous, because I think, oh, it's just going to continue to weaken people's trust in science as a whole. But polling is clearly one of those, right? Like people are like, oh, they don't know. People lie to them. The polling science has been brought under great scrutiny in the last 4 or 6 years, because people have felt that it's been inaccurate to a point that's been dangerous. But here's the from this Pew study. If you trust polling science, they ask a bunch of people what they think, and then they put these percentages on it, which is a kind of science that I know a lot of people are like, oh my gosh, now it's statistics, and I really don't understand statistics. But here it is. So this report that Pew has, and we'll put a link to it in the show notes here. Factual knowledge alone, it says, does not explain public confidence in the scientific method to produce sound conclusions. So in other words, people knowing stuff about science isn't enough. They say overall, 63% of Americans say that the scientific method generally produces sound conclusions, while 35% say that it produces conclusions that could be any result that the researcher wants. And I thought that was really interesting, that 35% of the people in the United States believe that science outcomes will likely be only what the scientist wants the outcomes to be. Wow, look at that. I think we've lost our friend Paul Wallace. But we did pick up Dan, who's not Paul Wallace. So Dan, I will pop you out of the window here and just go back to talking to myself till we get Paul back. And Paul will be back with us some moment. That little bubble will fill up again with Paul Wallace. But here's what I found interesting about this, and Paul can tap back in when he joins us, is 35% of the people in this country feel that scientific outcomes are just whatever the researcher wants them to be. That the rig is the rig is in. That this thing is set to produce an outcome that the researcher wants. A third. Now, we do a lot of talking around Vote Common Good about the civic engagement and how the civic engagement sort of produces this life with and for one another, and the civic life question around, do we trust? Is there some kind of basic level of trust that exists in our cultural society? There's just a lot of people who don't trust it, right? And this number, 35%, keeps showing up. So when Paul's back on, I want to ask him about this, because I think this is an interesting notion that, politically speaking, there's like 35% of people who do this, that, and the other thing. It's a third. And it's almost like there's an ability for a third of the population to hold to things that other people often don't feel are true, that just don't feel like those are the kinds of realities that they can trust. And that trust discrepancy, that 35% think the jig is up and the rig is in, that's a problem in our culture and in our society. So as we talk on Fridays here about science, some of it is to help all of us. Some of the design of it will be to help all of us become better at approaching science, for us to become more science fluid. Because to my mind, the degree to which we will trust scientists has something to do with the degree to which we can order our understanding of the world, and we can order our understanding to have some kind of an authority outside of simply our own tribal group, only outside of our own tribal context, only, so it's not just us that are that we're listening to and that we're trusting. And this is really the big question for all of us when we think about common good science. That if science is going to be about what's good for all of us, not just good for some of us, there has to be a openness to trust and to belief in shared conclusions. Now, as a religious person, I'll tell you, most religious communities, whether they're just generally spiritual or some of the more famous brand name religion or some of the more obscure ones, most religious experiences are not thought about, are not pitched, are not thought of as like the collective coming together, right? They are particular in their. That doesn't mean that they're designed to cause divide. In fact, true togetherness doesn't mean sameness. It means people of difference come together. And religion is one of those things that doesn't serve itself well, trying to be so unbelievably specific as a way of thinking and a way of viewing the world. So what we end up dealing with then is that religion doesn't serve that purpose very well. So what is something that people can have a shared understanding in? And science has tried to play that role. I think it should play that role. I would love it if it played that role. I think that religion playing the role, or that science playing the role of what we can collectively engage in is a really important part of things. Welcome back, Paul. Nice to have you back.
Thanks. Sorry about that.
Well, who can explain the science of internet technology? Nobody. It's big tubes that move things that move things around. I was just waxing on about the need for science to be understood as one of the shared trustworthy sources that we have in our society, and can it serve that purpose? And I was just suggesting that religion, by its own definition, is more particular to the human experience and doesn't serve well as a common shared understanding of the world. So no matter what your religious perspective is, whether you're in it, out of it, it's just not really what it does very well, right? And science is meant to be this global agreement about what is. And maybe even universal. I mean, if ET came down tomorrow, would ET know about electrons? They might not call them that. They might have, but they would probably know about it may be truly universal. That's how they got here, right? Yeah.
That's how they got here. Yeah, I hear what you're saying. Yeah, that makes sense to me.
Okay, so back to these studies. This other analysis from this Pew report says that the share of Americans with confidence in scientists that they'll act in the best interest of our society is an interesting number. Now, the research didn't only ask about science; it asked about other areas of people's lives and other ways that people are engaged. And science actually rates higher than many of the other areas that were studied, like public schools. Do we think public schools act in the best interest of everyone, what we call the common good? Do religious leaders act toward the common good? Does the news and business leaders and elected officials? Well, you might not be surprised, friends, to find out that elected officials are down at like 4%. Think that a great deal of elected officials act for the common good. 4%.
Wow.
With scientists,
that's lower than that. That's
35%. And with the military, it's up over 40%. Somehow we think that the people in the military act for the common good of all of us differently. Religious leaders,
more so than public school teachers.
Yes.
Wow.
Far more than public school teachers. Amazing, isn't it? So
yes.
So something's going on. I was surprised at this. I thought scientists would rate lower, especially in the last 4 years. I feel like we've had a national conversation led by our political leaders, specifically Donald Trump, that has attacked science at every possible turn. I thought since 2016, trust in science would decline. It's done just the opposite. It's gone up.
And it's the only one it's the only one in that group that has uniformly gone up. The only one. That's crazy.
Scientists and science practitioners have become more trustworthy in people's minds than all the other areas in our society. And maybe, I don't know if that's COVID related. I don't know what that's from, but it actually went up every year, even before COVID, like 2018, 2019, it just climbed.
I can't believe it. That makes no sense to me.
Well, then it's probably not true. That's what I've decided. Things that don't make sense to me, I've just said, you know what? That can't possibly be true. All right. So it goes on to say about half of the public, 51%, report a fair amount of confidence in science to act in the public interest. 51%, like, probably you scientists, you're probably thinking about what's good for us. And just 13% have not too much or no confidence that science are acting in our better interest. So I found this very encouraging, that people think that scientists are acting for the best interest of all of society. The numbers aren't, it's not 100% think they are. Nothing would be. But it's higher than every other group of, like, leaders or well thought of, cultural and civic leaders. Yeah. Does that strike you as good news as a scientist?
Sure it does. Yeah, of course it does. It does surprise me though, that it's as high as it is. Yeah. I guess I read too many headlines, about people who were anti-science and so forth. And clearly there's a lot of them out there, but I thought that number would be going up, not down. The number of folks who are, really don't trust scientists to do the best, to be helpful to society. I thought that number would have gone up.
I have a number of friends that work in the arts, right? And one is a really great Renaissance style painter, very famous. I'll name drop his name's Luke Hillstead. But anyway, Luke, when a few years ago, we were talking about art, and he's one of these people who will say, if someone comes and says, answers the question, like, so what do you do? Or what do you do for a living? Or how do you spend your time? When someone says, I'm an artist, he's like, I don't know what that is. What do you do? Like, do you paint? Do you make music? Do you dance? Mm-hmm. Like, he doesn't buy the idea that you just get to say, I'm an artist. He's like, that's useless. Like, sure, the arts are great. I want to know what you do as an artist. And then I see your this practice, this engagement inside of he feels like when you say I'm an artist, what it does is it segregates you off into some separate group.
That's interesting. Right? Yeah. I see that. Yeah.
It's the ist word. I think it's the ist.
Right.
In it. And it's been very interesting for me to use this idea that, man, like if you say, I'm a Christian, that's one thing. If you say I'm a Christianist, well, that's a whole other thing, right? Like, like I follow Islam or I'm an Islamist. Whoa. That's a different. So there's something about that. And I wondered about that with science. Like maybe the general way of talking about science causes people to be like, well, I'm not one of those. But then when someone says I'm a medical doctor or I look at the cosmos, I wonder if a little more specificity wouldn't be helpful when we think about science.
Yeah, like it would help. It resists the stereotyping instinct, I think.
Yeah, and that it's not me, right? I just think so much in our society is built around stereotypes, and is it me or is it not? Is that me? Do I see myself in that world or do I not?
Yeah, boy, and as a scientist, I can tell you, I tell people that I do physics. I'm not one of you, Yes. I'm not a math person or whatever.
Yeah. I heard some joke the other day. I think it was from a comedian talking about that. And he said, people always say this, like, I'm not good at math. Nobody says, like, I'm not good at walking or I'm not good at English or I'm not, like, why do we give ourselves an out instead
I'm not
of
a
saying,
skilled
like,
reader.
Yeah. Like, why not say, Oh, I don't know a lot about that, and I wish I did, because and that's what I'm getting at. It's one of these, like, there's something about the identity that strikes us with one another that feels odd, right? Where it's like, oh, that's an other. And the minute you otherize, you either elevate, like, to a level that you couldn't achieve, or you de-elevate,
denigrate.
You denigrate to say, well, yeah, those aren't the trustworthy ones. And you know, when we talk about common good and faith and science and all this here, I feel like this is going to be something that people are going to want to be thinking about when they go on these Friday journeys with us.
Well, I think it applies to Christians, even without the "ist" on the end. If I tell somebody I'm a Christian pastor, they're going to put me in a box. Boom.
Yeah.
Right there.
Yeah.
So I don't think you really need the "ist." I think that is definitely a situation where the othering happens. Yeah.
Yeah. And look, there's this funny thing. I've been a pastor for 30 years, something like this. And I know this is what old men say, but like, I do think that 30 years ago, the role of a pastor in society still carried some cultural credibility,
gravity.
And people say, oh, well, hello, pastor. Or, you know, I don't know, like pastor they just like were treated as one of the great professions. Not sure they ever should have been. Don't know that it was ever earned. Not going to critique where it was. I'll just mention, I don't think that's the case so much now. I think a lot of things have happened in the last 30 years where when you say like, oh, I'm a pastor as well, people are like, I mean, maybe it's a curiosity, but for a lot of people, the skepticism pops right up, right? It doesn't grant you extra.
Right.
How do you think that about scientists? Do you think that's on the move where science are like? Wow.
I don't think, not in the circles I live in. No, it might be among some people, among some groups, some some places, but not. I mean, I live right here by the CDC. CDC is a mile away from me. There's Emory University. There's Georgia Tech. There's Agnes Scott. There's a bunch of colleges all around. So, but that's just probably just a factor of where I live. But no, scientists, I've not experienced that. So
I guess I just, when I meet people that are like, especially like fancy scientists, you know, that I think are fancy, like obscure fancy scientists, like, you know, like I cure cancer, or, you know, I figure out water molecules and how we can extract them from the dew and make it possible for people to have drinking. Like, I just feel like that's the greatest, you know, because I know you said you're a theoretical physicist, so you work in what, as opposed to an applied scientist where you're trying to.
No, it's not theoretical. It's observational astronomy. Theoretical would be with somebody who just works largely mathematically. But yeah, it's not applied. That is for sure, Doug. It's not applied.
I see. Yeah, and that's different than theoretical. That's observing.
Theoretical is somebody who works with mathematics and physics. Einstein was a theorist.
I see. But you're not good at math, so you
mathematics.
Just
he didn't perform experiments and do observations. He followed them, and he knew what was going on with that world, but he did not himself design experiments and make observations. He just sort of did math.
Well,
and that's what we call a theoretician in physics.
Is that true in other areas of science as well? Or is that kind of a physics?
Yeah, I think it's largely true. I think there's even theoretical economists and biologists and chemists. Yeah, I think so. Maybe less pronounced, but I don't know that for sure.
Well, they don't have an entire cosmos to stare at out of a telescope like
that's right.
you birders and planet watchers get to do.
Yeah.
So this is Paul Wallace. Pretty much every other Friday, we're going to have these conversations. We're going to have scientists on with us. We're going to be talking about science. If you're interested in contributing to this, you put it in the comments. If you're on social media, if you're on podcast, you can email to podcast@voteCommonGood.com, and we will entertain your thoughts along with our guests and our other topics on Fridays. So, Paul, thanks for co-hosting the Friday segments with you, and we look forward to you being back in a couple of weeks.
Very welcome. Thanks a lot, Doug.
You're welcome, buddy. So that's Paul Wallace. He's going to be our friend around here. Hey, a couple of extra show notes, and Paul, you're welcome to stick around for any of this if you want. If this sort of turns your interest level up. On Fridays, of course, like we're doing now, we talk about science and common good science. But on Monday, we do common good news. So this is a daily effort. Every day, 10 a.m. Central Time, other than Wednesdays when it's 9 a.m. Central Time, we come to you with a common good call. So common good news, we're going to be talking about news. This coming Monday, we're going to be talking with Jonathan Wilson Hargrove, and he has put out a great article on what's happening with that insurrection that took place. And the reason we're going to talk about that as news is because next week, the impeachment trial of Donald Trump. Yep, again, country having to respond to the behavior of this man with a extraordinary statement that he violated his oath of office. So that's going to be happening. And the whole issue around the insurrection is what that's about. Jonathan Wilson Hargrove will be talking about that. So it's a news item. We're going to be talking about common good news and some news roundups on Monday. When it comes to our Tuesday time, that's when we talk specifically about common good politics. And we have politicians on. We talk about political theory. We talk about what's happening in politics. And the we in that one is all of you, of course, and then our co-host Rob Ryersey and we take a stab at that. On Wednesdays, we turn our hosting over to Laura Truax and Dominique Gilliard and Stephanie Spalding and myself, and we talk about a common good faith. And for those of us who are trying to think about what should our faith look like in a world of a common good, that's what we endeavor into on Wednesdays. So hope you're feeling that vibe in that movement. On Thursdays, we take on significant issues. Yesterday, we talked about climate and climate change and why do religious people respond the way they do. The next two Thursdays, we're going to talk about the issue of abortion. And we have a couple of guests on, both of whom have had their own experiences with abortion. And we're going to talk about ways to think about and talk about abortion that can get us beyond the polarization and the use of abortion as simply a cudgel or a dividing wedge issue, and to ask people to engage in a common good way of thinking about all of these issues. So we know that's a lot. We know there's a lot coming. We know there's a lot going on. We know that, when it comes to our conversations about all of these things, there's a lot to talk about. The reason we do a daily podcast and live stream is that we want you to bring all these issues together. We do want to be talking about politics, of course. We want to talk about the news. We want to be able to talk about faith specifically. We want to talk about science. We're going to talk about on other Fridays about economics. And we want to talk about issues that matter to you. I want you to feel like this is a community that you can be a part of and a set of resources that you can share. And if you know people that should be part of any of these conversations, let us know in the social streams, or again, you can email over at podcast@votecommongood.com. Now, if you're on Instagram, follow us over there as well. Go to Vote Common Good on Instagram. We'd love to have you do that. If you're a YouTuber, go over to YouTube and look up the Vote Common Good channel. And when you're there, please consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. It really does help us. It's a big thing for us to get more people that subscribe to these channels. It makes the magic happen inside of YouTube. So if you have multiple YouTube accounts, I don't know, subscribe on all of them, because you never want to miss one of our YouTube channel updates. So be sure you head over to YouTube and do it that way. Of course, we're on all the more brand name ones like Facebook and even Twitter. So this very feed populates into our Twitter feed. So if you know people that are only Twitter users and you've said they won't listen to podcasts, they're not going to go on Facebook, no way they're going to watch on Instagram, but they use Twitter, head over to Twitter, and maybe, just maybe, also find somebody over on Twitch. So we're also on Twitch, and really glad to be in all those places. And of course, super glad to have you along with us. And if you're, that's not Astrophysicist Paul Wallace. The Vote Common Good podcast itself, please subscribe to that. Go to votecommongood.com/podcast, or just go into your podcast app and look it up anywhere you always get your podcasts, and we are going to be there in those places. And I think, I've tried this, and I think it works for you too. You can even say to your smart speaker, play Vote Common Good's podcast on iHeartRadio. Give that a try sometime. So thanks for being with us. It's Friday, and it's Science Friday around here. Next week, we're going to talk a little bit about economics, the economics of science, and how we think about our economy How do we understand what works? Should people get stimulus checks? Should we be taxing people? How do you build a common good economy that works for, as the saying goes, everybody? So speaking of everybody, glad that you're all part of this with us. Thanks for being a part of the Vote Common Good podcast. We'll see you on Monday.